I'm always intrigued by one thing that wherever you go pan India, the Chinese food and the South Indian food has captured everybody's imagination, north to south. If you go abroad, in their hotel buffets, sometimes also there is South Indian food. How would you justify that? That how come these two dishes have taken the imagination and captured the palates of such a varied culture through our country?
You know, I think, can I take that because I've seen it everywhere? South Indian, I think, unfortunately, you know, the South Indian is over 4 states we're talking about. We don't represent the 4 states at all. We just represent that wretched dosa and idli everywhere. And less abroad, but I even here, every single buffet has dosa and idli.
I absolutely agree
Yeah,
to
I
this.
get so
Or the
fed up.
appam
Yeah.
and the stew.
Yeah, that's it. You know, 4 dishes the world over, or pan-India. It's a real pity, isn't it? Chinese is the other thing that I think is because in India we have this Indian Chinese which is fried. I mean, in some restaurants you do get genuine Chinese. You get steamed food and braised food. But generally, you know, if you look at Japanese food, as she was saying, there are 4 things and they're very defined because the Japanese are so clear. You know, there is braised, there is steamed, there is fried, and there's another one, I can't remember what they call it. And with Chinese, it's a bit of a mix. But I find that Chinese food does well in India because most of it is fried. Non-veg, veg, everything is fried. There's a sauce made, and that fried thing is thrown into the sauce. And listen, everybody likes fried, right? It's delicious to eat. It's crispy. What do we like about junk food? It's fried. So, you know, it's not because of just the Chinese flavors, but it's because it's fried. And abroad, I don't see, the Chinese food is not so big abroad. It's mainly in India that it's so big.
Kothari from VLF and PKF. VLF is the literary festival that you're attending, and PKF is the Prabha Khaitan Foundation, which is based out of Calcutta, working assiduously towards upliftment of and promotion of art, literature, and culture. I welcome you to the second day of Vidarbha Literature Festival, which is the first non-fiction literary festival and the largest in central India, in partnership with Maha Metro. We function on similar lines like the other established literary festivals across the country, but the difference that we do only non-fiction English authors. This grand festival brings together the fantastic minds of India and is only possible because of the unwavering help of our sponsors. All the sponsors, thank you so much. There is a small competition which we are running, hashtag Read and Ride. VLF in alliance with Maha Metro is running a year-long hashtag contest. We would like you to all of you to take pictures of you reading in the metro and post it on the social media platform of VLF, which is VidLitFest or @VidLitFest and Maha Metro, and also hashtag Read and Ride. And the maximum number of posts will receive first prize, books worth 10,000, and the second prize will be books worth 5,000. We are also running a unique make your own bookmark competition, and the winner will get one of the books from the authors in the 2-day fest. And so let us now start with our very uniquely curated panel that we have. Stone soup is the ancient food still relevant? I would request Monica Bhagwagar, SAS Women of Nagpur, to please introduce the panel and the moderator.
Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of Prabha Khaitan Foundation and the VLF, I welcome you this afternoon. We indeed have a great session ahead of us. I have the supreme pleasure of introducing our very august panel of today. I begin with Vidhi Berry. She is a specialist in the fields of holistic health, maternity, and child nutrition over a decade of experience. Her USP is a customized approach to client health in relation to their movement nutrition mindfulness. She endeavors to make every family nutritionally wholesome and creative through her meal plans. Decoding Motherhood and A Superfood a Day are her two literary offerings. Abhilasha Setia is our next glamorous guest for this afternoon. She is passionate about food in many dimensions. Through childhood, her journey became more studied, experimental, and creative. Abhilasha found herself making several firsts around food. To help people with renal ailments and enjoy a palatable meal, while following medical requirements, she co authored Healthy Cooking for Patients with Kidney Ailments. She is currently conceptualizing a modern cookbook. I must mention here that the book, A Superfood a Day, has been co authored by Abhilasha and by Vidhi. I am now delighted to introduce to you a dear friend and an international name, Karen Anand. I think she doesn't need much introduction in Nagpur, but so happy to have you here. And she is an international Indian food writer, television personality, and restaurant consultant. She has founded Karen's Gourmet Kitchen, a gourmet food company, and markets by the name of Karen Anand. She has authored, hold your breath, 20 books and hosted 3 television books. So, without much ado, may I request Jyoti, Priyanka to please escort them on stage. And of course, we have our wonderful moderator, Parveen Tuli.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Monica, for a wonderful introduction. And I am so delighted to be present to really talking about food coming from the hospitality business. So, I would like to begin to begin with Karen. Let's ask her because of the experience that you have.
That means old age, I know.
So indirectly, but not the young spirit in the old age. So Karen, I would like to really ask because today's panel discussion, is all about ancient food in modern times and how the evolution of the taste and food industry has been. So food industry has always been fascinated, and in India it's considered to be a family affair where family bondings and everything came from food industry, where like you're sitting on the table, you're eating the food. But nowadays we live in an era which is more like a Zomato age. So when you sit on a family table, somebody's ordering pizza on a click of a button and all of that. Would you like to start telling us more about how, in your own experience, you've seen the evolution of this journey?
That's a big question. You know, unfortunately, I would love to say that I see people cooking more. I think, just taking my own family as an example, I think people, you know, my children who are in their 30s love home-cooked food. They love to come home. I have to bribe them because otherwise I don't see them. They don't live with me anymore. They've both got their partners. But I bribe them with food. So I say, you know, I'm doing this particular thing on Sunday, then they come. Otherwise they don't, I think. But anyway, it's a big draw. But they cook themselves as well. Their partners, they're both boys. And strangely enough, their partners, who are both working women, don't cook. So that's what's happening, you know. So I think they don't cook. They're both highly skilled women, highly professional women, and what's the need of cooking? They never lived at home long enough. One's a doctor, one's an educationalist, and you know they don't cook. So I think what's going to happen is with couples working more and more, and joint families, of course, you know, splitting up, there is going to be this urge for quick meals. Urge for assembly meals. Having said that, I've written a book about Indian recipes and old Indian recipes, and I've tried to include in Masala Mem Sahab recipes which are ghar ka recipes, which can be done quickly, because I think there are some, of course, laborious ones, but most of them are quite quick, and I think that's going to be the future, is quick cooking. People just don't have the time to do the 2 and 3 hours. About foreign foods, yes. I mean, Chinese, Italian, all of this is going to be popular. But I still think, I worked with a multinational many years ago, and they were trying to launch, I won't mention which one, but because I don't particularly believe in what they do, but they were trying to launch a product in India, and they found it very difficult to break what they call dal bhat roti shak. So they very difficult to break that pattern in India still. People want to eat dal chawal, at lunch. When they started launching their product as a snack, it did very well. But as a substitute for lunch, it didn't. So I think our patterns, especially out of big cities, are not going to change. People might order pizza for the evening, but generally there is that. I think our food will remain on the table for this generation, but it will be quick.
Then talking about quick fixes and quick meals, we have our nutritionist and experts here who. So how does it impact? This question is for you, Vidhi. How does this impact the quick fixes? How does this impact the nurturance that the food is? The food is actually there to nurture your soul and body, but how does the quick fixes impact your family's health?
So when we think about quick fixes that are available in the market or that people know about, which is, it could be just a sandwich, it could just be a pizza like you mentioned, it's not a balanced meal. So it's just one category. When we talk about nutrients or we're talking about proteins, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins and minerals, maybe one or two categories are there. Whereas the meal pattern she mentioned, the dal, rice, vegetables, is actually everything. So it is absolutely impacting your health because you're not getting all food groups and we are not being nurtured. And that's why our book, to have quick fixes, quick meals with all those categories and food groups.
I saw that your book is all about growing children. It's such a great relief because the biggest question in everybody's house is khane mein kya banana hai? And you're helping them to give them a guide around the easiest way of doing it. I'll also like to ask Abhilasha your question because what we heard here is there has been a generational gap between the food taste and the choices of food. And when you've worked with patients, especially, how do you see this, the day-to-day routines, food, and the generational gap that has been created to a complete nutrition cycle that we all can get into?
Good afternoon, everybody. So I just want to speak a little bit about why I decided to write the book. So my grandson was turning 4 years old, and I just wanted to gift something for his birthday. And I was just thinking that what can I do, what can I gift him? And then I just thought that I'm so passionate about cooking, so let me start working on a cookbook. And then when I was started doing a little bit of research, there aren't really any cookbooks specifically for children recipes and nutrition. And now coming back to it, then I was also thinking that, when I watch my children and how they kind of, looking after my grandson, the style of parenting has changed totally. How we brought up our children, and now once I'm seeing the younger generation, they're very, very much more mindful. They're very careful about what to give, what not to give. And so I think it's very important for us to kind of understand what they want, to respect what they want, and then actually try and create. So I just want to give you like a small example. So my children, they live in Singapore, and when we were visiting, so we were almost 3 generations together. It was my in-laws, it was us, and it was them. And so when we went there for the first time, they said, I think we were just carrying a box of chocolate, and they said, we can't give him no chocolates at all. So my in-laws said, "Arey, chocolate? हम लोग तो हमेशा दिए chocolate, so how can you not give?" So that's what I'm coming to, So now you have to be mindful, you have to think, you have to be creative, you have to respect even what they are saying. And that's how I started thinking about that how can we kind of, keep both the generations happy and see that what we can give. So instead of giving chocolates, I innovated a date ball, which looked like a chocolate, and it had nuts, it has seeds, it was very healthy, yet it was very yummy. So there are various ways of, how you can bridge the generational gap. I think the most important thing is to understand each other, to respect each other, and also kind of narrate, do things together, cook together in the kitchen, and also narrate like I would give them examples of how my mother, because I've always seen she's been my biggest inspiration, and I've always seen her cooking and how to adapt what she has been doing and how to adapt into things like ghee, which I ate always by growing up. And few years, I think after once we were teenagers, there was a complete switch from ghee. It was oil all the way. So now it's back to ghee. So just these small little things, how you can make them understand and just put it all together.
So, because of the connectivity of the world, we are geographically, literally, we have the whole global palette on our dining tables by choice, and even with the global revolution around the food industry. Like, um, there was a survey which says momos is the best selling food of India nowadays, with the street food that we were talking. So, you have been a front runner in bringing international food to India, Karen. And I've read, I'm a big fan of your Masala Memsa book, because when you open it, it's basically you're navigating through cultures. It's not about one recipe, it's about a story behind that culture and how you bring it up with the ingredients that you bring it up. Would you like to talk about your research around how you conceptualize Masala Memsa after so many different books? I'd like to know the research work and the
but
stories.
I'd also like to just say one thing completely different. You were talking about khana mein kya hai, which is the problem that women have and unfortunately, it's still a woman's problem. I was watching something the other day. It was an interview, an old interview by Oprah of Aretha Franklin, and they were asking her, and Oprah was asking her about her life and what were the difficult times of her life and various albums and. And the thing, she turned around and said, I can do all of that. I can do singing, I can do producing of show. But the most difficult thing is when somebody asks me, what's for dinner? So, I think even the great Aretha Franklin had to say, that was important. And I think we all, even if we're cooks, even if we enjoy cooking, I get fed up, So if the men in the audience, far and few between, can collaborate, I think that's one thing in a house. You were saying, what is there for dinner every night? My God, it's a headache. And even though there's two of us only in the house, now it's still, what do you feel like eating? Anything. Have you heard that? Yeah? I get that a lot, right? Anything. But it's not, that's not a sentence or not a reply for me. And I get that anything will do. But anything won't do. Because I said, will you eat a salad? Oh, not really. Do you feel like a soup and salad? Well, not really. You said anything, So I think if the family can be more collaborative and you get children, my children never say anything because they're brought up by me. So they never say, they're very clear what they like and what they don't like, sometimes too clear. But my husband is one of the anything partners. So I think if we can just learn from that experience and just be a bit more collaborative. But you were asking about Masala Memsa. Let's go back to that. So I was sitting at COVID, and several people, one or two were publisher friends, who said to me, look, you've done, you're known for bringing European food into India, partly because that was my background. I didn't see a business opportunity or anything. I lived in Europe. I grew up in Europe. And so for me, and then when I came back to India, that's what I knew. It wasn't what I studied. I didn't study anything to do with food at all. I had an academic education in something quite different. But it was an opportunity, and I found people weren't eating this kind of healthy food, sort of your salad. I opened the first salad bar in Bombay and so on. And so, from that, I became known as the sort of salad queen and European food and so on. But it was partly because it was European, partly because I found the kind of food I liked in Europe was very healthy. I didn't promote heavy sauces and French food and that kind of thing because I find that isn't really healthy. So that was my way. When Masala Memsa was my ode to Indian food, it was COVID. I had a lot of time on my hands and a lot of people saying it's about time you do an Indian book. So I just looked at all the recipes I had over the last 30 years. So it's really a collection of 30 years of recipes. When I was doing my TV shows and I was traveling, I've been keeping a food diary since I was 18. So I have recipes since I was 16, 18, maybe, yeah. Certainly since I went to Paris when I was 18. So that's a long time. And so I keep writing recipes. In those days, we didn't have computers. I write recipes down. I keep them somewhere, you know. I even have recipes that people have given me on the back of a napkin, you know, on the back of a paper napkin. I've kept those paper napkins. So it was a question of putting it all together.
And are you the masala queen? Because do you travel with your masalas?
I do. I do now because I've had a terrible time in the past when people have invited me over. When I've been to a great thing, you know, when I went to Bali once and we were actually staying on our own, but we met somebody who was a friend of a friend. He insisted we come and stay with him. I said, what can I do? What can I give back? How, you know, I didn't bring a gift because I didn't realize we were staying with you. He said, look, can you do dinner one night? And there were some very fancy people for dinner. I remember it was Michael Douglas's first wife and all sorts of fancy people. And I said, I have to do something, you know, quite spectacular. So they insisted I did Indian food. And I probably in those days, this was 15, 20 years ago, I knew maybe 5 Indian dishes properly without looking at a recipe. And I went around Bali in a hired car looking for ingredients. And it drove, I mean, I produced some chaat, some prawn curry, some something, but it drove me mad. And from then on, I realized I'm not going to be put in this position again. I will now travel with my masalas, and I do. I travel with Panchfuran, I travel with a bit of Goda masala, I travel with Malwani masala, because I just don't know. I mean, I've mentioned Suhana in the book, which is an old Maharashtrian company. I travel with Suhana spices because they have these ready packets that are absolutely amazing, I must tell you. I did the writing of their recipes for the UK market, and so I had to try every one of their 50 recipes, the 50 packets, and they all work really well. So I have to now because I'm not going to be put in that embarrassing situation again.
Lovely. So, talking about ancient food, I have read your Superfood a Day, and you've brought millets into trend, you've brought potatoes, sweet potatoes into trend, and all of that. I'd like to know the story behind conceptualizing this book to how the challenges that you faced in bringing these ancient foods and introducing them to your families and to the world.
See, she conceptualized, and then we came together to really face what's happening in the world today in our homes. That our children prefer the pastas and the pizzas, and they want that stuff. And we are thinking, how do we raise the next sports stars in our house? So the minute that is the conflict itself gives you the solution. It was very easy for us to try these out because my children are not as open-minded. Her little grandson is very open-minded. Mine are a little older, and we were trying all these experiments. So I remember making a Nutella laddu because laddu is for me the traditional ancient concept of food, and we've liked besan laddus and all of these things, and these guys want cake. Who will eat laddu? So I said, okay, Nutella laddu, just like how we did the date balls. Now, I didn't say what's inside that, but I wanted it to be a protein bar. And we put sattu, we put almonds, we put nolen gur because I live in Kolkata. And it worked. Later when he discovered, he was like, what are you feeding me? But he's a budding squash star. I need him to have his protein. So that's just one story of trying it out in our homes and then taking it from there, investigating with families. What are these kids eating and wanting for dinner? Everyone says fussy eater, picky eater, right from a 6-month-old to a teenager. And we want to make them have the pizza or the pasta. How do we bring it in? So we add millet flour, we add jowar flour, we add a little sattu in there also to add the protein element and make the dough at home. So bringing in all of those elements is what made it come alive. Yeah.
So yeah, just taking it from there, like you said, superfood. So that's why we came up with 10 superfoods. So naming a few like raisins and almonds and a millet, of course. And also this is the year of the millet. So I feel the awareness is also much more than what it was before. So keeping all that in mind, each and every recipe has one superfood. And also to add to what Vidhi said, that also nowadays there's much more availability in terms of all these health foods or healthy foods, like different kind of bases you can make at home, but also outside there are a lot of things which is available, so it's much easier. Even pastas, now there's so many different types of pastas which are available. So I think it's much more easier for people who are more mindful and who keep their health and nutrition quotient in mind. I think it's much easier to even source all these things.
One of the recipes that I enjoyed is the sandesh, like apple sandesh with honey, which was very interesting combination. So one of the things that I realized in reading your book, especially, was you have kept the names, like the authentic names, like the laddus and the sandesh, introducing kids and not making it globally, like this is a pancake or like that. In the sense, you have kept that Indian ancient touch to it. My next question is people associate ancient food with the richness of it. And I think, as Karen was mentioning, that richness has different various perceptions. In India, maybe a thick Punjabis have a thick gravy is called as richness. Maybe in different countries, different sauces and the spices are considered to be rich. How do you now bring, when you talk about globalization, how do you now introduce your family with richness coming from various palates? Yes, Karen?
Are you saying that how do you cut it down, or how
Yeah.
do you
Yeah. So, like, if I am coming from a Punjabi family, for me, rich food is the kali dal, makhani, and all of that. But when you talked about, richness can be without sauces, that's rich for somebody in Europe. So that was eye opening to a degree where, richness is considered differently. And our young generation is now introduced to various palates from, it can be coming from Europe or from USA or Chinese, or especially the Pan Asian, all of that. So, how do you bridge the gap of, because every global food that came to India was earlier like Indian Chinese. It was washed into the Indian authenticity and considered like, acha, Indian Chinese chahiye, masaledar types. So my question is, does all global foods go through a transition when they come to India?
Oh, of course they do, but they also go through a transition abroad. So Chinese food, for example, sorry, I couldn't understand the richness thing, but Chinese food, for example, in England,
Yeah.
of course, China is a big country, like India is a big country. So the kind of Chinese food you have in England is very bland. The kind of Chinese food you have here is spicy. So, it's not necessarily Sichuan. Now we understand the difference, but we still don't really understand. And similarly, I've done 2 restaurants in the UK. They don't really understand regional food very well, regional Indian food. It's still very much North Indian. It's still the tandoori chicken and the kali dal and so on. So, I think what we're trying to say is richness. If you're talking about, it's like the word health.
Yeah.
Healthy in a Punjabi family or any North Indian family was always someone that's a bit more too. And health doesn't mean slim. It means somebody who's healthy is generally somebody who's fat. So I think we have to get rid of those perceptions. And I think it's happening with maybe not for the right reason. With all this online and Instagram, everybody wants to be thin still. And, taking Ozempic and all of that, that's the latest thing to remain thin for a long time. Celebrities doing that. So I think the thinness thing is going to push people to eat hopefully less. There's nothing wrong with eating kali dal and eating ghee and all of that. But remember, that was all of that, and I discovered that while writing Masala Mem Sahab. Yesterday, for example, I did something at Kala Ghoda Festival, and I cooked the dishes myself at some Maharashtrian and so on. There's a lot of oil.
Yeah.
Traditionally, a lot of oil. Even in something like masale bhat, there is, 2 cups of oil to one dish. It's a lot. But if you're going to walk 10 kilometers, to your home or something, maybe you can absorb that kind of oil. Of course, you're not going to eat the whole patila of the masala bhat. But I think all of those kind of recipes came from a particular time. I even got somebody to make it with me because my hand is different. My hand won't put two cups of oil into something, but his did. So I think if we're doing that kind of exercise, if we're doing that kind of regime, if we're balancing out the diet, we can still eat like that. But if you're not, then you have to stop.
Totally.
Just wanted to add something about the richness because we were, talking about ghee as something we really like using in our food. But obviously, there has to be a certain measure. And because we're working with kids, we must understand that fats actually give energy. But what kind of fats? So we started working with richness when we use almonds and nuts. So adding those layers, so cashews, for example, in your paneer gravy. And then instead of adding a lot of cheese to your pasta, she was experimenting, okay, let's put a little bit of crumbled paneer in it. For certain things, let's grate some coconut in it. So it does bring in the taste and richness factor, like you said, but gives fat as energy and not sluggishness. Yes.
Almond flour. Like we use a lot of almond flour also in various things like cakes and pancakes and rotis. So, adding the richness flavor to the food.
What, according to you, is the most trending ancient food which is trending in the current generation? What is more acceptable? Which of these foods?
Probably millets now, because everyone's talking about millets. I get a little bit tired of it because I personally can't digest millets, and I'm not a big grain person. But it's become political, so a lot of chefs are using millets. It's not a bad thing. I tell people it's like fashion. It's couture and pret. So once big chefs and fancy chefs start using millets, then other chefs start using it, which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But having said that, we've been eating millets for years.
Yeah.
We've been eating jawar, we've been eating bajra. All of that is very much part of even the Maharashtrian diet, the North Indian diet. So even in Rajasthan. So it's not that it's new, but I like the idea that chefs are using millets in interesting presentations in different forms. So I think millets is something which is here to stay because of
Yeah.
the whole
millets has
government
come
thing.
into snacks. I think that's really what's trending, because all of that food that you're eating in the evening at 4 or 5, that's where the millets have come in. So, the concept of the jowar bhakri to getting it into the theplas and to the ragi puffs for little toddlers, that's the exciting part, which is trending.
Use millet for cupcakes and pancakes. So, and also bread, like different kinds of breads, so use as a snack with some kind of a filling. So, yeah, I think millets definitely.
The next controversial ingredient that most of the people now are in conflict is milk. Like nowadays, because we've been grown up with drinking milk glasses, and now it's like, oh, milk is good, milk is not bad. So what's your take up around using milk, cow's milk, buffalo's milk, and how does the new generation milk, which is the almond milk and the other milks, how have you guys replaced it in your own line of work?
Well, mine is particularly, personal. I don't drink much milk. I mean, I had that tea, but I'm not a big milk fan, and neither is my family. Unless it's a milk sweet, because my husband has a terrible sweet tooth. But I was working with nutritionists when I first came back to India to understand the basis of Indian ingredients, and they were very anti-lactose. For the simple reason that cow's milk is for a calf, not for humans. So I'm very pro, although I love cheese, and I think I could never be vegan because of cheese. And that's the only thing. Cheese and butter, they're God's gift, I think. But milk, I mean, I'd like to hear what they say, but this whole thing of milk being given to children as that they have to drink cow's milk or buffalo milk, I think really has and there's so many people who are lactose intolerant today. So I applaud the fact that oat milk and almond milk are now available.
I'll take that question because there are people who are lactose intolerant, like me, and my children aren't. Okay. There's a place for everyone, and everyone's gut is different. So just like you absolutely cannot prove with a clinical certainty that a certain kind of food is good or bad, even in terms of veg, non-veg, or roots growing under the ground, I think cow's milk is the same topic. Now, when the world says that everyone has to drink cow's milk twice a day, that's when we hit that problem. Because you commercialized it, you were torturing animals to a certain extent, and there was a lot of political as well as practical difficulties that came in. So I would say it's an autocorrection in the world, where we say, okay, 30% absolutely can't digest this product. Some digest it beautifully and grow, and they have good vitamin B12 levels, and some are sort of on the fence. And I'd like to clarify that oats milk, almond milk are not substitutes for cow's milk. They have totally different nutrients. So whatever you're not getting if you don't consume milk or it doesn't suit you has to come from other foods.
Exactly. So I think it's also a personal choice. So coming back in the book, we have used milk and also used a lot of chena and paneer and also a lot of yogurt dishes. And also, of course, we've also used almond milk and oat milk. So also it is also a very personal choice.
The adaptability of it, like because I see the new generation very adaptable, but the old generation are still like, no, let's go to the traditional way, as you said. So now I would like to know about the research work that goes behind, because especially food, you've been working with food as a healing medicine, you can say, the diet as a healing medication for patients. So how have your journey been around that food, using food as a medicine of the journey towards the healing?
So for me, both the books have been actually very personal. The first book being a cookbook for people suffering from kidney ailment. So the whole research, it was a very personal journey because my husband was going through a major kidney problem and he had to undergo kidney transplant. So until he was diagnosed, until the kidney transplant, it was almost a journey of 4 to 5 years. And in a person suffering from kidney ailment, food is very, very important. And when I was finding out when I needed something, there was not even a single book in India which I could refer to for kidney people suffering from kidney ailment like a cookbook. There was nothing at all. There are a lot of books in the West, but I couldn't relate to most of it because they were all non-vegetarian. And as me being a vegetarian, so I think it's been a lot of my own personal research. And of course, in the second book, again, when I was trying to, work on the recipes, I cook a lot, but I don't follow any measurements. I was just discussing that with Karen. So, again, I had to kind of make all these things again in my kitchen. And then coming back to the research, but then when I started thinking, I was thinking that, I can create a lot of recipes, but I don't have so much of knowledge about the nutrition. That's how, I called up Vidhi and I spoke to her and asked that, Vidhi, I'm writing this book, I would really like you to help me with this book. And I got a very positive response from her that, I would love to co-author this book. So yeah, any book, lot of research is needed. And also you need to hear and adapt and learn a lot from the younger generation. I think that's very, very important. A small thing in the second cookbook, when we were doing our research as to how we can make this cookbook different from what is already available. So then my son came up with the idea that, Mom, young parents like us, we all really like to cook, but we don't have so much of time to go through the lengthy recipes. So what you should do is you should create a video and you should have a QR code in your book. So actually, almost 40 to 50 recipes have QR codes, and if you scan the QR codes, it takes you to the video tutorial. So I feel these are the small things, that you have to keep an open mind, you have to learn from others, and anything what you do, a lot of research is needed, to put this. Took us almost 2 years to put this book together.
I love the QR code idea, definitely. So let's ask. I'd like to know your personal food choices now. Like interested in knowing your personal food choices. So, what is the most exotic or unusual dish that you have ever had? We'll start with you.
Exotic.
Yeah, or unusual that anything. Anybody who has can come up.
I've had in China, not knowing what it was. I eat everything. By choice, I'm vegetarian most of the week, and I eat seafood. But I have to taste everything in my profession. So I had little. I think what they call them is they look like cockroaches, but they're actually little animals. They're like little kind of bees. There were these sort of locust black things. Anyway, they were deep fried and they were crunchy. And I had them and I thought, this tastes a bit, they just tasted crunchy. And we didn't have Google Translate in those days, but I think it was the equivalent was a sort of ant or cockroach. But I just believe that you should taste everything once, and if you like it, you repeat it. If you don't like it, you don't eat it again. I didn't realize what it was when I was having it.
Singapore is promoting it now as protein.
That's right. That's right. They're promoting. Singapore's been doing it for a while, and you go to really fancy fancy restaurants, and there are these insects on the menu as protein. Yeah, it's a bit disgusting, but
Yeah. Any other food combinations that were absolutely polarized, but you enjoyed it?
So I really like Japanese food. Yeah, because I think because of the flavors and the textures, I find it very fascinating. So when I had gone to Japan, so we went to this restaurant and which had only tofu dishes. And I don't think I've ever eaten better tofu dishes in my life. And there was only tofu. And everybody kept saying that, I don't think by the end of it you're going to get really tired. But I think I personally really, really enjoyed it.
and that's really unusual because Japan is so non-veg otherwise, and I think to get good vegetarian is something that's quite
so Karen,
unusual.
I was really surprised. So, I was taking a delegation of the ladies study group from Calcutta, and we were 30 of us, and mostly we were all Marwaris. And but my elder sister also lives there, so that was a bit of an advantage. But we were carrying a lot of food from Calcutta, thinking that non-vegetarian food would be a problem. Ultimately, when we were leaving from Japan, we had to just leave all the food which we were carrying from there because there was so much of vegetarian food available everywhere. So I think it's more of a myth that, Japan,
No, I'm not saying it's not available. I'm saying
Yeah.
that the Japanese cuisine per se is non-veg.
Yes.
So when you go to any sushi bar
Yeah.
or any little ramen restaurant, generally there is not,
Yes.
not that veg is not available.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that their cuisine generally is
Yeah.
non-veg.
So I think only you have to I think it's easier if you pre-order.
Yes,
then,
you have to pre-order.
they can take
That's
care
what
of
I'm
it.
saying.
Yes.
You have to pre-order.
Correct. Absolutely.
So what can be called your current signature dishes? What's your current favorite? Or what would you be known as, Karen Anand's signature dish? What would that be?
I do a lot of things. People, I say I've been cooking for 35 years now professionally. So people come to me and they say, we remember, some wild rice salad that you did 20 years ago. Great. So a lot of people remember the salads I did because I had a salad bar in Bombay for
Yeah.
a long time. And I did hundreds of salads that we used to keep repeating. So people remember odd things, but now hopefully people will remember some of the dishes from this book. There are some iconic dishes, I think I would like to leave a legacy that people remember me for the more healthier
Okay.
dishes. And for example, I don't do desserts, so for me it was very difficult to get desserts into this book because intrinsically I don't eat sweets. So to kind of highlight sweets was difficult.
Yeah.
So there are a few sweets, which there's a particular Naivedya halwa, which is a very Puneri Maharashtrian halwa, which is a long and very old recipe, which is made with bananas and lots of ghee and lots of sugar. But that's a very typical recipe. So I've done 2 or 3 of those, but if you see the book, there aren't many desserts.
Yeah, great. Anything that you would like to be remembered as your signature dish, or maybe your current one that everybody asks you to make?
So I think the current one from the book, there are 2 things. One is, of course, the date balls have become really, really popular, All the kids just seem to be loving it a lot. And it's a date balls. So dates, and it's got pistachio and almonds, so and some coconut. Yeah, and for me, I think it's going to be more about regional cooking and lots to do with even Rajasthani cooking. Yeah, because that's what, I like it and I would like to make more and research more.
Would you like to add to this?
When we did the book, what I really liked is how we reinvented all the Western junk food with a lot of vegetables, a lot of proteins, which are Indian, like sattu. We use pumpkin, kaddu, kacha papita. And I'm one of those blessed people who thinks everything is tasty. So nothing surprises me or disappoints me, but that was our favorite of being able to put the superfoods into all of this food that was previously junk food.
And what do you think is the most underrated food from our culture?
I think probably all the gourds, because traditionally your wax gourd, your dudi, all of that. Generally, when you say in the family, shall we do? I saw a dudi ka sabzi in your book, and I said, I love dudi, I love turai, I love all these kind of gourds, but they're not very sexy. Guys in the house, if you say dudi or something, they're not very. So I think if you make them in a different way, as non-vegetarians, for example, in Goa, we make a dudi with tiny prawns. And that sort of elevates the dish. And you can do it with vegetarian as well. So I think it would be great to highlight gourds because they are really our ancient food. Yeah. If you're talking about ancient foods of India, it's gourds. Yeah. We didn't have tomatoes, potatoes, chilies, any of that before. So we had spices, but we didn't have all of that. Half the vegetables, I would say most of the vegetables we eat now are not vegetables that were native to India, but gourds were. So I think if we can highlight those, because they're pretty healthy too.
We have Lauki ka dhokla in the book,
Yeah.
so that's...
I never looked at it before you said it like that. Yeah.
We also have a vegetable with lauki and with mangodi. So keeping both the lauki part and also mangodi because it's healthy, so.
Brilliant. I think lots and lots of food. I'm already hungry by having so many conversations around it. But I think thank you for the contribution that you guys have been into this industry. And great to have a conversation around it. Over to you, Priyanka.
We could take, if anybody has any questions to ask, yes.
I'm always intrigued by one thing that wherever you go pan-India, the Chinese food and the South Indian food has captured everybody's imagination, north to south. If you go abroad, in their hotel buffets, sometimes also there is South Indian food. How would you justify that how come these two dishes have taken the imagination and captured the palates of such a varied culture through our country?
I think, can I take that because I've seen it everywhere? South Indian, I think, unfortunately, South Indian is over 4 states we're talking about. We don't represent the 4 states at all. We just represent that wretched dosa and idli everywhere. And less abroad, but I even here, every single buffet has dosa and idli.
I absolutely agree to this.
So
or the appam and the stew.
Yeah, that's it. 4 dishes the world over, or pan-India. It's a real pity, isn't it? Chinese is the other thing that I think is because in India we have this Indian Chinese which is fried. In some restaurants you do get genuine Chinese. You get steamed food and braised food. But generally, if you look at Japanese food, as she was saying, there are 4 things and they're very defined because the Japanese are so clear. There is braised, there is steamed, there is fried, and there's another one, I can't remember what they call it. And with Chinese, it's a bit of a mix. But I find that Chinese food does well in India because most of it is fried. Non-veg, veg, everything is fried. There's a sauce made, and that fried thing is thrown into the sauce. And listen, everybody likes fried, right? It's delicious to eat. It's crispy. What do we like about junk food? It's fried. So, it's not because of just the Chinese flavors, but it's because it's fried. And abroad, I don't see, the Chinese food is not so big abroad. It's mainly in India that it's so big. South India, I don't know, where are you talking about abroad that you see South India? South Indian food? Maybe that way. East.
New York, South Indian food. Yeah. Lexington is just full of lines of South Indian restaurants.
That's different. Yeah.
Exactly.
In London, it's only in the south.
But you're right, because also Chinese, in India, it's totally different. When you go overseas, you don't get to see this kind of Chinese food at all. And in Calcutta, it's full of the restaurants in Calcutta. Chinese food for some reason is really, really popular in Calcutta. All these Indian Chinese restaurants.
The other thing is, remember, I'm a staunch advocate of no MSG. because I'm intolerant to it. But I don't think one should put MSG in one's food. MSG is monosodium glutamate and it is a chemical. It never used to be a chemical. It used to be an extract of seaweed. When it was first made in China and in Japan, it was an extract of seaweed. And when you're extracting seaweed, it is vegetarian and it's a taste enhancer. Nowadays, we're putting MSG in Indian food. The amount of Indian, when you think about it, how long does it take to make tandoori chicken? I'm sure there's lots of tandoori chicken makers here. It's at least an overnight marination, 4 hours marination, right? Think about it. A hotel, you order room service and then the tandoori chicken comes in 30 minutes. How is that possible? Have they got chicken marinated there for you? How can it be? They're not marinating chicken every day and or maybe they do a little bit. So there is taste enhancer. There is MSG used in Indian food ad hoc now. All your little street food guys are all using MSG. They're using it for tandoori, whether it's paneer or chicken. They're using it for dals. They're using it for biryanis because it's a natural taste enhancer. So the same thing, I think why Indian Chinese tends to be very Moorish and you want to eat it is because of the MSG. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And Maggie had a big
Absolutely.
story about it. And I was very anti it. And in fact, they asked me to come and work with them years ago. And I said no. I had the privilege of saying no because I didn't believe in the MSG. So what did they do? They put something called disodium glutamate. And they're very clever. When you look on the back of the ingredient packet, it says E something. You know, when you see an E, it's an ingredient which is a secret ingredient. They don't need to tell you what it is. It's the way big companies fool us. So E something, even FSSI Indian laws, E something, you don't have to declare what it is. So they put disodium glutamate in their food, which is just like monosodium glutamate. So it's a taste enhancer.
We have this question from the
Hello, yes.
lady there in the back.
Sorry, I can't walk up to the front, forgive
No,
me.
no worries.
I wanted to, you're talking about your wonderful books, and I wish some of them were on display right here.
They're available down, I think.
They're
downstairs.
available.
I know they're available, but you were talking about them. I wish you could have held them up. And the second thing is about this quinoa. Can somebody enlighten us, Madam Karen, maybe?
Quinoa. They want
Quinoa.
to know about quinoa.
What is it? And
Quinoa is it's a fantastic grain. Of course, it's not regionally or ancient Indian, but it's definitely, I think, here to stay. I wouldn't say it's a food fad, and it's quite rich in vitamin B12, rich in protein. So quinoa is something that's quite available, and it can be used as a substitute for rice in biryanis. You can use it in your salads. So it's there and it's here to stay.
And also plant-based, so
Yes, absolutely.
But everything's plant-based if it's grain. I think quinoa also came in because it was grown in America and in South America. And again, it was big companies promoting it. So whenever big companies promote things, they tend to be marketed well. Sorry, I can't see you. Are you behind the photographer? So it tends to be marketed well and therefore people talk about it. You know, today everyone's talking about, if we're talking about big companies and people talk about, look at the badam in India today. A lot of the badam in India today is Californian almonds. It's so sad, they taste like sawdust, but that's what's in India today, and it's probably cheaper than getting good badam, but it's available everywhere. Californian walnuts are available. Californian, imported fruit. How many of us have to buy those imported apples and now imported bananas? So as soon as big companies talk about quinoa, it became such a fad, didn't it? And so on, it becomes fashionable.
are California almonds not nutritious?
Nutritious, I don't know. I know about the taste. I don't like the taste. Are they nutritious?
yeah, they are nutritious. Yeah.
I mean, they have the same amount of
They are,
nutrition
so they
as
are
mamra.
nutritious.
Like, probably the different, the fine. Yeah. So I just wanted to ask, like you talked about the quinoa puffs and the ragi puffs. How much of ragi or quinoa goes in that puff? I mean, how do you, and they don't label it, right? How much percentage is there? So to make them into that, I mean, rolling a roti out of ragi is such a difficult task, and making a puff out of it.
I think
So-
it depends on, there's a little nuance here. So when we have the biscuits, ragi biscuits or, millet biscuits that are out there, it's a very small quantity. Because if you read the label at the back, you'll see that the ragi is not the first ingredient. And the first ingredient is the largest in percentage. But when we talk about, the specific companies that are doing children's foods, like a Slurp Farm or a Hungry Bums, these are the companies that they are actually making the product with the millet itself and not mixing other things. So there are this
So
sort
we'll
of
have to-
divide in the market. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. Now, all of us have lot of answers for 2-3 days. Ghar pe kya banana hai. So, thank you so much. And I would like to invite Neeta Kale auntie, Neeta Kale, the trustee of Chitnavis Center, to please felicitate our authors on behalf of VLF.